Thank you for inviting me. Before my near-death experience, I worked in Mexico City, specifically in the Iztapalapa delegation. My role was as a supervisor in the probation department of the juvenile court. I really appreciated my job, especially because it allowed me to interact with teenagers. I used to joke that I would continue doing this work until the day I died. I had no idea how prophetic those words would turn out to be. It's quite curious, isn't it? It all began on May 5th, 2006, when I had a kidney stone stuck on the right side. I had had stones before, so I immediately recognized the symptoms. At first, I thought I could wait it out or endure the pain, hoping it would lessen, as it had on previous occasions, but this time was different. The pain didn't subside, so I decided to go to the emergency room. I took it easy, walked in and simply said, "I have a kidney stone here," based on my previous experiences. I expected them to take me to a room, give me morphine, and that the pain would go away. However, things didn't go as I expected. At the hospital, they not only found the kidney stone, but also discovered that I had a kidney infection. They treated me with antibiotics to fight it and decided to keep me hospitalized overnight, scheduling surgery for the next day. The surgery itself went well. They managed to break up the stones as planned. But unbeknownst to us at the time, the antibiotics they had given me were not effective against the infection I had. That turned out to be very dangerous. When the stones were broken, the infection, which was essentially poison, entered my bloodstream. This led me to develop sepsis, and my body began to collapse. Not only my heart and lungs, but all my organs were affected. It was a truly critical situation. Despite how serious everything was, what I remember the most is that I didn't feel fear when facing the possibility of dying. As a born-again Christian, I have a strong belief in heaven, and I was sure that's where I was headed. That certainty gave me a deep peace in those crucial moments while I processed what was happening. All I could think was, I'm going home. According to medical records, I was clinically dead for about an hour and 45 minutes, but my experience during that time was completely different. I remember leaving my body and ascending quickly through the floors of the hospital, passing through the blue sky and reaching beyond into outer space. It was amazing. Describing that speed is difficult, but a verse from the Bible always comes to mind. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. That's exactly what I felt. I moved faster than the blink of an eye. By the time my upper eyelid touched the lower one, I was already in heaven. It was truly awe-inspiring. As I traveled through that other realm, I remember seeing what some might describe as a light at the end of the tunnel. However, to me, it looked more like a window, a portal to another dimension. I'm not saying it was literally a window, but that image best captures the essence of what I experienced. As I passed through this window, the feeling was absolutely right. Everything was in perfect harmony. There was a profound peace, an atmosphere completely free of tension or discomfort. In that moment, what struck me the most was the sense of belonging. I hadn't realized how out of place I had felt on earth until I experienced this. Arriving in heaven, everything became clear. That was my true home. Everything in heaven looked at me with indescribable warmth, and when I say everything, I truly mean everything. It wasn't just God Almighty, Jesus Christ, or the Holy Spirit who welcomed me. Heaven itself seemed to celebrate my arrival. I felt that welcoming spirit in every aspect of my surroundings. The trees, for example, seemed to rejoice upon seeing me. Even the flowers seemed to smile and greet me. That feeling of universal acceptance was deeply moving, something I had never experienced before. Everywhere I went, it seemed like everything was happy that I was there. That sounds incredibly profound. What was it that you most desired in that moment? You know, I hadn't even realized this desire until I arrived, but above all, I wanted to see Jesus. I wanted to meet him face to face. That meant everything to me. I learned that heaven is not just a place you're waiting to go to, it's about being with someone in particular. Can you describe your path to find Jesus? As I walked through a forest, many trees were blocking my way. I felt that Jesus was beyond them, and I thought I had to go through them to reach him. As I advanced, the trees seemed to move aside by themselves. It was incredible. How did that make you feel? I felt as though the trees on either side were whispering in unison, "You're going to see the King. You're going to see the King. You're going to see the King." That was the overwhelming sensation I had, as if all of creation knew what was happening and shared in the anticipation. Then I emerged into a wide, open space, and there he was. Jesus was to my left, looking at a group of angels, and those I call the redeemed, those who had lived on earth and were now in heaven. What was your reaction when you saw Jesus? As I approached him, the first thing I did wasn't to stand tall or walk directly to him. Instead, when I reached his side, I fell to my knees and hands, focusing my gaze on his feet. Can you describe what you saw? He was still looking at the crowd in front of him, a number so immense it seemed to count in the millions, perhaps even billions of people. I was looking at the side of his feet, unable to raise my head enough to see his face. I barely caught a glimpse of his legs, but at that moment, I couldn't look higher. What were you thinking or feeling at that moment? The only words I could utter were, "You did this for me." At that moment, everything inside me, every part of my being, knew that the only reason I was in heaven was because of what Jesus Christ had done. Overcome with gratitude, I felt a deep thankfulness for his sacrifice. How did you express that gratitude? The only thing I could do was keep repeating, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." I felt completely overwhelmed by gratitude. What revelation did you have in that instant? I stopped and realized that the only reason I was there was because of what he had done. Even though I understood that he had done it for everyone, the feeling was intensely personal. I felt as if he hadn't just died on the cross so that I could be there, but that he had created all of heaven just for me. I don't want to sound selfish, because that wasn't my intention, but I really felt that he had done it all just for me. That's a powerful feeling. What did you do next? I began to look at his body, starting from his feet. Slowly, I observed his ankles, which seemed to love me, then his calves, which also radiated love. His knees reflected the same feeling. Every part of him I looked at exuded love for me. His hands loved me. And when you reached his face? When I finally saw his face and he looked at me, there was something deeply touching in his gaze. He looked at me as if I had never disobeyed him in my life. That perception was incredibly impactful. That must have been overwhelming. How did you interpret that look? It made me reflect on the nature of his forgiveness. I remembered what I had read in the Bible in chapters 8 and 10 of Hebrews about how God forgives and forgets. That look of Jesus, filled with forgiveness, made me understand that he truly forgets our sins. Experiencing that look, I felt affirmed as an eternal being. I understood that although my body could die, the true essence inside me, would never perish. That is a profound revelation. What happened after this encounter? After that moment, Jesus imparted something inside me, something I can only describe as if he were downloading information into a computer. Then he looked at me and said, "No, it's not your time yet. Go back." It was that clear, exactly as he said it. How did you feel when you were sent back? I felt relatively at peace with the decision. Curiously, I didn't return through the forest in the same way I entered heaven. Instead, I passed over the forest as if I were flying above it. Can you describe that flying experience? It's not flying in the conventional sense. It's more like deciding, I want to be 3 meters above the ground in that place, and immediately you appear there. It's similar to how, in the Bible, Jesus walked on water. There's no fear involved, which allows you to rise as high as you want. That sounds incredible. What happened when you reached the place where you entered? When I reached the point where I should exit, it wasn't that there was a physical door that opened. I simply knew that with the next step, I would leave that realm. I stood there for a moment and realized my body wasn't ready. I just wasn't prepared, and in fact, that made me happy. So what did you do? I remember I turned around and exclaimed, "Yes!" In front of me was the forest, and I knew Jesus was on the other side, but I felt an impulse to go to the left of the forest. When I did, everything around me seemed to explode in joy. What I saw was truly spectacular. I saw mountains, but they weren't ordinary mountains. They moved like the waves of the ocean. As they moved, it seemed like the waves of the sea passed by me, except these were majestically moving mountains. I felt overwhelmed, thinking, "Oh, this is wonderful," and I absorbed every moment because, honestly, at that moment, I thought I would stay. That sounds amazing. What did you do next? I felt a strong call to return to Jesus. So I started heading back toward him. This time, I approached from the other side, and for some reason passed behind him before returning to the same position where I had been before. When I bowed before him again, he began speaking to me once more. This time I noticed the light that emanated from him. I hadn't mentioned it before, but a brilliant glow radiated from his being, completely enveloping me. That sounds beautiful. What happened after this second encounter? After our conversation, he looked at me again with a gaze full of tenderness and love. He lowered his gaze to me and repeated, "No, it's not your time yet. Go back." Hearing him say that it wasn't my time yet, I flew over the trees once more. When I reached the edge where I had entered before, it seemed that with just one more step, I could leave. I was about to go, but suddenly I realized again that my body wasn't ready. I felt a great relief and profound joy, thinking, "Yes, I'll stay." So, you had another opportunity to explore. Yes, this time, instead of going left, I decided to venture to the right of the forest, and I discovered many wonderful things. It seemed that this side was dominated by the elements of water. There were seas, rivers, and various bodies of water in that area. The colors were incredibly vibrant, especially the blues. They weren't like the blues we know here. The colors there are much more intense than we can imagine on Earth. As I walked through the place, I encountered saints and had different experiences. I also saw many animals, which surprised me quite a bit. There's a great abundance of animals in the sky. That's fascinating. What happened after that exploration? I finally returned to Jesus. It was as if they had always been there, and I don't know why I hadn't noticed them before. Once again, I returned to the same place near Jesus where I had been before, first focusing on his feet. But when I lifted my gaze, I saw my family in front of him. Seeing my family was a deeply moving experience. My grandmother Maria was right in front, standing out within a group. Behind her were other relatives, and even farther back, more generations of relatives who had had a connection with Jesus Christ and the Father. They all advanced to greet me. That must have been very emotional. Had you seen them before in your experience? Now that I remember, I realize they were present in my previous encounters with Jesus. They were there the first time and also the second time, but I hadn't paid attention to them. My focus had been completely on Jesus. However, this time, for some reason, after focusing on Jesus, my gaze turned toward them. It was as if seeing them was part of this visit. To describe those seen in a heavenly vision, it involves capturing the essence of their supernatural appearance. Could you say they were radiating with a radiant light? Their faces were illuminated with infinite joy, and they had broad smiles. It was as if pure happiness surrounded them. Reflecting on this, could you express a poignant realization? Later, I marveled at seeing my entire family in heaven, all smiling together, something I had never seen on earth, enjoying each other's company. This captures the beauty of the experience about the change in understanding of family bonds in heaven. Could you express it like this? Before, I imagined heaven as a place where we all became part of God's universal family, simply interacting with one another. However, this experience revealed to me that family ties are of great importance to God, deepening my understanding of relationships in heaven. If unexpected faces appeared in the heavenly gathering, could you express it this way? To my surprise, I found people I didn't expect to see there, which challenged my preconceived ideas about who would be in heaven. This recognition highlights the unexpected and vast nature of grace and acceptance in the divine kingdom. Reflecting on the unexpected presence of certain people in heaven, could you say it this way? At first, I thought they hadn't qualified for heaven because they didn't meet my expectations. However, they met God's criteria, not mine. When asked about God's requirements to enter heaven, could you explain it like this? According to my understanding, God's criterion is accepting Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. That is the essential requirement set by God. Describing the continuation of your heavenly experience, could you express it this way? After this profound encounter, my family warmly received me. In those moments, Jesus conveyed deep teachings to me, and I was completely immersed in the heavenly realm, experiencing collective worship and praise to God. It was a glimpse of heavenly harmony. To convey the pivotal moment of your return, could you add this? But then, in a significant turn, Jesus looked at me intensely and commanded, "No, it's not your time yet." That command marked the moment when I knew I had to return. Reflecting on Jesus' command to return, could you describe your reaction this way? When Jesus gave that command, I felt as if all creation before me moved aside, making it clear that his words were only for me. I felt like a soldier responding to a superior officer. Instinctively, I stood at attention and replied with determination, "Yes, sir." It was as if, in that moment, he needed me more on earth than in heaven, although he didn't say it in those exact words. That was the deep feeling his presence conveyed to me. As you prepared to leave, an important interaction occurred. My grandmother Maria, who was also there, looked at me intently while Jesus spoke. His words were a powerful instruction: "Take as many of ours with you as you can." He was referring to our family that was still on earth. It was an important mission he entrusted to me, describing your departure from heaven. You could say, I bowed deeply to Jesus in reverence, then passed over those heavenly trees, moving quickly toward what I call the edge of heaven, with a decisive step transitioning from that divine realm. I found myself back in this earthly existence. When they ask you how you felt upon returning, you might reflect. Although leaving that perfect peace was hard, understanding the importance of my mission on earth filled my return with purpose and determination. Upon returning to earth, the emotional intensity was overwhelming. I felt deeply sad, like a baby crying in desperation. I vividly remember floating above my hospital bed, seeing my own body below. The medical team had stopped their efforts and began putting away their equipment. I even heard the doctor mention that he was about to sign my death certificate, regarding the continuity and transformation of earthly relationships in heaven. You could explain. In heaven, I recognized each of my family members and felt an intense and unbreakable bond with them. But the dynamic was different from on earth. There, our love was purified and perfected, without earthly conflicts or misunderstandings. It seemed like every interaction was filtered through our divine connection with God, creating a harmonious unity. After Jesus reiterated for the third time that it wasn't yet my time, I was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Despite my initial resistance, Understanding the importance of the tasks I had to fulfill on earth helped me accept the need for my return. This mission, given to me by Jesus and reinforced by my grandmother's loving command, was clear: to make a significant impact by bringing back as many souls as possible. My grandmother Maria had entrusted me with a task: to bring with me as many souls as I could. I knew that was my mission. As I left heaven, the sensation of speed enveloped me, just as it did when I arrived. Returning to my hospital room, I saw my own motionless body on the bed. The medical team had stopped their efforts and was cleaning up their equipment. One of the doctors was even finishing my death certificate. I stayed floating above my body for a brief moment before returning to it. What happened when you returned to your body? The moment I merged with my body, the heart monitor came to life, emitting sounds that broke the silence of the room. The surprised medical staff rushed to my side to resume emergency care. They intubated me to ensure I could breathe again. The serene peace I had experienced in heaven contrasted sharply with the state in which I found my body upon returning. How did you feel physically after this experience? I was extremely weak. My body had suffered great trauma, as I had been clinically dead for almost 2 hours. The recovery process was slow. However, spiritually and emotionally, I emerged. How has this experience changed your view on life? Everything has changed. My ideas about life, death, and the eternal nature of our soul have been profoundly transformed. Now, I live each day with the certainty that our earthly existence is fleeting compared to eternity, and that every second is valuable. I have become more dedicated to loving others and sharing the message of God's love with as many people as possible. I no longer fear death, but I value life and the divine purpose I must fulfill here even more. You mentioned that you live with a greater sense of purpose. Could you elaborate on that? Of course. After my journey to heaven and my grandmother's directive to bring as many of us as you can, I felt a deep obligation to share my experience and explain the reality of heaven and God's love. I strive to live each day with the awareness that our actions have eternal significance. How has your near-death experience influenced your relationships? Tremendously. Now, I see each person as someone deeply loved by God, just as I felt that love firsthand. This understanding has made me more patient, more compassionate, and more motivated to share the immense love I experienced in heaven. I also value family bonds much more, understanding their importance not only in this life, but also in eternity. You mentioned seeing animals in heaven. Could you describe that further? Yes, the presence of animals in heaven was an unexpected joy. There were many, from species known on earth to mystical creatures I had never seen before. Their perfect integration into the heavenly environment reflected an absolute harmony that went beyond humanity. This experience made it clear to me that God's care extends to all His creation, not just humans. That's truly fascinating. Did you interact with the animals? Not directly. My attention was completely focused on Jesus and then on my family, so I didn't have contact with the animals. However, I could feel their joy and peace. Just like everything in heaven, they seem to be praising God in their unique way. You've talked about the beauty of heaven. Could you expand on that? It's hard to describe because there are no earthly words that truly do it justice. The colors were more vivid than we can imagine here. The light filled everything, but it wasn't blind. It was warm and inviting. Everything seemed alive in a way that's impossible to explain. The trees, the flowers, even objects we'd consider inanimate on earth vibrated with their own essence, and the harmony was complete. There was no decay or imperfections. It was a level of beauty that surpassed anything I could have imagined. You mentioned that Jesus downloaded information into you. Can you explain what you mean by that? It's difficult to put into words, but it was like an instant infusion of knowledge. It wasn't as though he spoke to me with words. Instead, he transmitted understanding directly to my mind or spirit. Suddenly, I understood aspects of God, heaven, and life that had previously been beyond my reach. Although some of that knowledge faded when I returned to my body, much of it stayed with me. Could you share any specific revelations you had? The most important one was a deeper understanding of God's love. I thought I understood how much He loves us, but the reality I experienced was much deeper than I could have ever imagined. You mentioned spiritual warfare. Could you talk more about that? Yes, my awareness of spiritual forces at work, both good and bad, has significantly increased. I understood that many of the challenges and difficulties we face are not just physical, but have a spiritual dimension that we often overlook. This revelation has led me to be more intentional in my prayer life and to embrace what the Bible describes as the armor of God. Your experience has changed your perception of death completely. My fear of death has disappeared completely. Now I see it not as an end, but as a transition to something far more glorious than we can imagine. This doesn't mean that I'm in a hurry to leave this world. I know God has a purpose for me here, and I'm committed to fulfilling it. However, I have total peace when I think of the day I will return to heaven. Has this experience changed your perception of time? Time definitely didn't exist in the way we understand it here in heaven. Everything happened in an eternal present. This perspective has made me see the fleeting nature of our difficulties and challenges in the grand context of eternity. It has also increased my awareness of how I use my time on earth, understanding that every moment is invaluable and has eternal consequences. You mentioned that you encountered people in heaven whom you didn't expect to see. How has this changed your view on salvation? It has made me much less judgmental. Now I understand that God's grace and mercy are much broader than we often recognize. Salvation is not about following a strict set of rules or achieving something. It's about accepting Jesus and His sacrifice. Now, I am more careful in assuming I know the spiritual condition of others. In the end, only God can truly see the state and intentions of each person's heart. Sorry to interrupt. You mentioned that now you live with a greater sense of purpose. Yes, the colors of heaven are incomparable to anything we know here. They were deeper, more intense, and glowed with an inner light that made them seem alive. The interaction between light and color was completely different from what we experience on Earth. It was as if everything radiated from within. This unique combination of shades created an atmosphere of indescribable joy and peace. These colors were beyond our earthly understanding, awakening awe and joy every time I looked at them. The beauty of heaven makes the colors of earth seem dull in comparison. In addition, I saw colors that do not exist in our visible spectrum, tones impossible to describe with our earthly references. You mentioned that everything seemed to radiate an inner glow. With these colors, did you have any impression about the size or extent of heaven? Heaven felt both intimate and infinitely vast at the same time. When I was with Jesus or my family, it seemed close and welcoming, but at the same time, there was a sense of infinite immensity, a beauty that extended in all directions without limits. It was as if heaven expanded as needed, perfectly accommodating everyone and everything in a state of absolute harmony. You said that all of nature in heaven seemed animated and responded in a way that cannot be explained in earthly terms. Could you elaborate on that? Yes. In heaven, nature was not static or inert. The mountains moved with the softness of ocean waves, and the light itself seemed to have consciousness, enveloping me with its warmth. What we would consider inanimate here on earth seemed to possess a living essence, all united in an act of worship to God. Did you perceive how others were experiencing heaven? Although my own journey was the most obvious to me, I did notice that everyone around me was experiencing the same deep joy, peace, and love that I was feeling. It seemed like each person was wrapped in their perfect moment, but at the same time, we were all connected in collective worship and joy in the presence of God. You mentioned feeling reluctant to return to earth at first. Reconciling with the idea of returning to earth was a challenge. The beauty and perfection of heaven were overwhelming, and part of me resisted leaving. However, I believed that God had a reason for sending me back, and that conviction gave me peace. It helped me see my life here as a mission to share my experience and help others prepare for eternity. How has your experience affected your view on worship? Worship has completely changed for me. In heaven, worship wasn't just an act, it was a way of life. Everything and everyone was in a constant state of praise, not out of obligation, but because of a genuine joy and love for God. This has completely transformed the way I experience worship here on earth, filling it with a new passion and depth. Were you aware of what was happening on earth while you were in heaven? Not at all. I was so immersed in the beauty and awe of heaven that I had no notion of what was happening with my body or in the world. It wasn't until Jesus told me it wasn't yet my time that I realized I would return. Has this changed how you view your work or your daily life? Without a doubt. Now I see every task, no matter how small, as an opportunity to bring a piece of heaven into this world. Whether in my work, my interactions with others, or even in the simplest routines, I try to approach them with the same love and joy I felt in heaven. It has also made me more intentional with how I use my time and resources, ensuring they contribute to something of eternal significance. Did you have any perception of how prayers from earth are received in heaven? Although I didn't witness individual prayers being received, I had an overwhelming certainty that there is constant communication between heaven and earth. I understood that God is deeply involved in the lives of people, fully aware of their struggles and longings. Prayer is not just words sent into a void, it is a real and powerful connection between us and heaven. Did you gain any insight into the role of angels? Yes, I saw angels in heaven and had a clear understanding of their purpose. They seemed to be in a continuous state of worship, fully dedicated to carrying out God's will. I realize they play a much greater role in our lives than we often recognize, always acting under divine authority. How has your experience affected your relationship with those who don't believe? It has given me both a greater urgency to share my faith and a deeper patience and love for those who don't believe. I now understand that each person has a unique spiritual path, and that God's love reaches everyone, no matter where they are on their journey. I try to share my experience in a way that invites rather than pressures, always respecting the free will of each person. Did you receive any understanding about free will and God's sovereignty? This is a theologically deep issue, but yes, I gained some understanding. I felt that God's sovereignty and human free will are not in conflict, although from our earthly perspective, it's difficult to comprehend how they coexist. I understood that God's love is so immense that He grants us the ability to make real decisions, choices that can bring joy or suffering. Even when our choices lead to pain, God is always working to bring something good out of every situation. Did you have any revelation about the nature of evil or the presence of suffering in the world? Although I did not experience evil in heaven, my experience there gave me a deeper understanding of it by contrast. The absolute goodness and love I felt made the corruption of the world even more evident. I realized that evil is not an independent force, but the absence of God's goodness, a distortion of His perfect creation. This understanding strengthened my determination to bring God's light into the darkness of the world. How has your near-death experience affected your fear of death or the process of dying? My fear of death has completely disappeared. I no longer see it as an end, but as a transition, one that leads us to something far more beautiful than we can imagine. That doesn't mean I'm in a rush to die. I firmly believe that God has a purpose for me here, and I want to fulfill it. But when my time comes, I will embrace it with joy, knowing the incredible reality that awaits me. What message would you like people to take from your experience? I want people to understand that God's love for them is greater than they can imagine. Heaven is real, and it is more beautiful and perfect than we could ever comprehend. The decisions we make and how we live our lives on earth have eternal significance, but the most important thing is that what truly prepares us for eternity is a relationship with Jesus. It's not about being perfect or following a strict set of rules. It's about accepting His love and forgiveness. Thank you for sharing your incredible story with us. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude? I just want to emphasize that although my experience was deep and transformative, the most important thing is not my story, but God's story of love for humanity. My hope is that by sharing what happened to me, people will be motivated to seek God for themselves and live with an eternal perspective. Thank you again for giving us the opportunity to hear your experience. Your story is truly amazing, and it leaves us with so much to reflect on about life, death, and what comes after. Thank you once again.